When a video game series has to adapt with new features or change the way it does things, this can often alienate the player base. Adding elements from other genres or changing the format of the game altogether can make or break a title and even the franchise's future. What really matters most in these transitions is still providing returning players with the same sensations as had always been presented in previous titles. If the originally intended atmosphere and user experience can be conveyed in a new way, then many players will often be excited to try this new entry, and will often leave with a favorable opinion on where the series is headed for future entries. The vast majority of early iconic video game franchises had to make that dreaded jump from 2D to 3D at some point, if they intended to keep up with technological expectations of critics and consumers. Sure, more than a handful of franchises kept their top-down or side-scrolling aesthetics due to comfort or intended design, but for many intellectual properties out there, the next great frontier of 3D graphics was begging to be conquered. Platformers like Mario and Sonic, as well as action games like Duke Nukem and Wolfenstein, all made their attempt at this new style. For some franchises, things went pretty well, and for others, the transition didn't go as smoothly as hoped for. However, the Metroid series absolutely knocked it out of the park when transitioning from its only known existence as a side-scroller to a vast, interesting, and most importantly, perfectly understandable new three-dimensional adventure. We'll figure out exactly how Nintendo and Retro Studios made this possible as we take a look at what is arguably the GameCube's most beloved title and discover what's so great about Metroid Prime. In order to understand everything that feels so right about Metroid Prime and its user experience, let's take a look at how the planet of Talon 4, this game's setting, is portrayed to the player in this new 3D manner. After that's been established, we'll dissect how Samus's many abilities made the transition possible as they aided your success at navigating these many changes. The map of Metroid Prime is much larger than has ever been seen in the Metroid series, and that isn't just a matter of map size and how many rooms are strung together, but even the scope of the individual areas themselves. Stepping into big rooms is so much more impressive and exhilarating than was possible in any previous Metroid game, because now, as you step through a door, you can see the entire room and the scope of the next area you're presented with in a single glance. In every other side-scroller-based Metroid game that came before, you could discern between big and small rooms on a map, but in terms of player observation, the most you could really notice is the fact that the room extends some degree beyond your forced perspective, of however many blocks you can see on the X and Y axis. Larger rooms or outdoor areas in this title are also well structured in a sense of presenting the platforming sections on opposing sides from where you may first be observing the new area, so that without too much detective work, you may still be guided towards where you need to go next, since the game no longer plays virtually left to right. Metroid has never really been a horror series by any means, but the atmosphere is always meant to be tense, exciting, and sometimes unsettling. The limited perspective of the first-person view definitely helps bring this franchise to the atmospheric level it has always striven for. Now that you can no longer see what's around you at all times, it's a lot easier for an enemy to get the drop on you if you didn't notice it upon entering a room or you've been giving your attention to something else. It's by no means a jump scare per se, but turning around to see an alien monster in your face can definitely put the excitement back into exploring an unknown world. As for the player's controls and understanding the space around them, the L button lets you lock your sight but continue to move and strafe while firing, but the R button locks your feet and allows you to aim your arm cannon from a stationary position. This is a great division of labor for the introduction of a first-person shooter, especially one where the primary joystick is used for both movement and aiming. Your general point of view is locked to one horizontal axis to avoid disorienting the player. Aiming at a specific high or low target with the right trigger requires more player ability, and is typically reserved for more complicated puzzles and enemies later in the game, or at least safer locations in which an inexperienced player can experiment with this more complicated point of view. The first challenging room you come across in the Chozo Ruins doesn't harass you with large enemies or powerful hits, but instead a frustrating yet fair abuse of speed, and how that contrasts against your limited field of view. The number of enemies is overwhelming as they circle you, and any new players will need to get a grip on pivoting and locking on before they advance any further. The space jump upgrade for your boots changed from being a supersized singular jump to a double jump, which suits the changes in platforming within the third dimension. Instead of requiring specifically sized jumps that you can just barely make with a particular upgrade, The new style of platforming is more about precision and control. Sure, the second jump gives you a little more height or distance, but more importantly, it allows you to jump more easily between standard platforms, or with more finesse between more complicated arrangements of structures. Early on in the game, platforming will remain pretty simple, with most structures around the Chozo ruins being close to the ground or otherwise cut and dry in understanding how to traverse these areas, whether you know you can approach these obstacles with your current set of suit features or not. Upon reaching the second major area, Magmoor Caverns, however, we finally have a bit more in terms of complex platforming, as well as the combination of platforms and combat as we progress over the lava pits. Some platforms sink, and Magmoors and Puffers will knock you around if you don't take care of them with your blaster first. Beyond an understanding of how the world is unraveled and presented before the player, one possibly greater issue to overcome when changing formats and perspectives is how the player specifically views the material being presented to them. The visor, or perhaps visors, of Samus's signature suit are really where the user experience of this game diverts from the way information was collected and perceived in previous Metroid games. First off, using the inside of Samus's visor as the user interface for the new point of view is a great way of introducing the player to this new format, while providing the same information they would have had access to in previous installments. You can see all of the important information, such as which visor or blaster you're using, as well as health, missiles, or anything else you'll need to keep track of on your journey, without it getting in the way of seeing the action on screen. What's more than that, it actually fits perfectly well into the digital aesthetic of what Samus herself would be seeing, pulling the player further into their immersive adventure. Scanning enemies with your fancy new scan visor will tell you what their weak points are, and afterwards your combat visor will lock onto this point. Your first free-roaming mini-boss style heavy enemy, the plated beetle, gives you a big sweeping introductory shot to really draw your attention to the creature's glowing abdomen. Knowing what you've previously learned about locating weak points, this reminds you that you may want to switch to your scan visor to update your blaster's focus, since you haven't had to scan during combat in quite some time upon arrival to the ruins of this game's primary setting. Finding a central position in a new room or giving the immediate area a brief scan could introduce information or enemy positions that you may have been entirely unaware of until it was too late. There's more to be scanned than just enemies, however, with environmental hazards being explained as well as lore and information to be gathered for either the benefit or just enjoyment of the player. There is a log entry very early in the game that is written by a space pirate, referring to a metal-clad hunter who attacked Zebes and subsequently destroyed the underground bases. This entry is of course referring to the events of the first Metroid game, with the unnamed hunter being Samus. In case you weren't aware, the events of Metroid Prime actually take place between the first and second Metroid titles, well before the events of Super Metroid and Metroid Fusion. As you explore the ruins where we find ourselves post-prologue, you'll find that there are a handful of ancient Chozo writings about Samus. In fact, we're receiving a lot more backstory on the Chozo in general. This new information includes the purposes of the Chozo statues we've seen throughout the Metroid titles, and how these structures protect the secrets of the Chozo species and their great power, represented by the power-ups they've shared with Samus since the very first Metroid game on the NES. In the virtually dialogue-absent series that is Metroid, it's easy to forget that many of the creatures and antagonists you come across are actually intelligent races. Sure, maybe not the living gas bubbles or spiked Roombas, but the space pirates actually constructed many of the terrestrial bases that Samus has ventured through in previous installments. Just because they don't speak, or at least speak a language that is understandable to us, doesn't mean they're mindless monsters, and while they have always been easily qualified as dangerous or violent, Metroid Prime actually conveys more of the fact that somebody had to build the locations you find yourself in. Someone left these journal entries and constructed this machinery. Metroid Prime also introduced many new ways of observing the environment around you, notably with the existence of the thermal and X-ray visors. Immediately after collecting the thermal visor, the lights shut off and you are attacked by two shadow pirates. If you previously scanned these specific enemies during your earlier encounters, you may have noted that they use cloaking technology, yet they have been perfectly visible to you while using your basic combat visor. However, now that you're fighting in the dark, they will be rendered virtually invisible outside of your use of your newly commandeered heat-based visor. So, once you've got the hang of fighting those specific enemies, you may leave that room and be attacked by another new enemy you can barely see. Now what's the deal with that? Well, these are mechanical drones, constructed of cold steel, so of course they won't show up on thermal scans. So now you're given a great reason for being thoughtful as to which visor you're equipping. Certain other electricity-based enemies will also mess with your visor if you get too close. Sometimes when branching into a new format, common features will be dropped or changed dramatically, but there are also some core mechanics that you just can't get rid of without riots from fans. One of Samus's defining abilities, for instance, is her morph ball function and the features that come with it. This ability had to be completely reworked in the transition from 2D to 3D, and I find it really interesting how they changed the feature for the better, as well as how they conveyed these new purposes to the player. Right after collecting the morph ball upgrade and returning to the main area of the Chozo ruins, you may notice that one specific structure looks oddly artificial, and if you try rolling around on this ramp-like structure, you'll notice you don't have any way to gain speed in your ball form, yet there is a glowing item at the top of the ramp for you to come back and try to get later. In fact, if you try this in the same room you acquired the morph ball ability, the game will mention the boost ball upgrade, so you're presented with the existence of a feature that's new to the series entirely. Immediately after receiving the bomb upgrade for the morph ball, you'll be shown a demonstration of the little jump effect that takes place when using the bomb directly beneath yourself, which you'll need to do on your way out. However, before you go, there's also a notable piece of wall on the opposite side of the room that may have drawn your attention due to the markings and aqueducts on the floor. If you bomb this wall, you'll find a helpful little missile upgrade and be introduced to another piece of the game to keep an eye out for. The morph bomb also now has more of an electrical charge effect rather than a default explosion. This goes hand in hand with the fact that it can also be used as an energy source in certain generators. I greatly enjoy the change in perspective when you're doing a morph ball based puzzle or segment of the game. The camera either switches to a cross-section view of wherever you are, like in older Metroid titles, or gives you a wider field of view to keep track of what's around you. Also, since your movement isn't restricted to one plane of existence anymore, the spider ball function now has designated rails to be used on. These are presented in some very obvious and conspicuous locations earlier in the game, well before you get the spider ball, so that players know there is a very specific way of interacting with these structures, as well as leaving a mental bookmark in the players' heads that tells them returning to these interesting panels will lead to those secrets that Metroid players love so much. There are very few rooms in the game's first area, the Chozo ruins, that cannot be accessed before leaving, but they make sure to put a few notable sections on your map just out of reach without specific upgrades. This guarantees that anyone checking their map will exhaust all options to access the areas within their reach, but keep the inaccessible locations in mind to return to later on in the game. Just like in classic Metroid games, enemies will respawn once Samus has left and returned to a room. This may be noticeable earlier on with small enemies popping back out of the ground, but the first time it's actually beneficial to be aware of this is after shooting all those small alien plasmites that give off light. If the player kills too many of these creatures before noticing the diminishing light level, then they may have more difficulty navigating the acid in the now darkened room. But if you retreat momentarily into the last hallway, these firefly-like creatures will return. Let's not forget to talk about this series' namesake either. The screens around your first Metroid encounter mention the benefits of attacking with missiles and the Metroid's susceptibility to cold temperatures, both very important facts to keep track of, as well as mainstays in the franchise since the very beginning. The developers also presented your first face-to-face encounter with a Metroid in a fantastic way, speaking from a user experience perspective. When you first step into the room housing this Metroid, a short cutscene will play of Samus slowing down and taking a dramatic look at this creature in the tube. Let's say you've never heard of Metroid as a creature before and don't know anything about these games and how chaotic an enemy the Metroid species is. Well, luckily, it's locked away until you scan the creature itself. Upon doing so, the game will tell you the only way to escape from a Metroid's grasp is by rolling into your morph ball and bombing it from the inside. I don't even think the first Metroid game told you that. It just had to be discovered if you had any hope of survival. This is invaluable information to you as the quarantine creature busts out of its enclosure and attacks you at close distance. In this new 3D environment, it's going to be difficult to fight these speedy demons, so utilizing all of your tools, your morph ball, missiles, bombs, different visors, and virtually everything else at your disposal will be critical in facing off against these terrifying, face-sucking aliens. With how many new crazy features had been added or changed in the development of Metroid Prime, it's incredibly impressive how much this entry still feels like its predecessors. If you could present Super Metroid from inside Samus's helmet, this is what I would imagine it would feel like, because Retro Studios took so much care in preserving the Metroid style we knew, and just presenting it differently. The jumping feels as lightweight as it's always seemed from the side, and you'll have many of Samus's familiar tools at hand to fully explore a larger world than was ever possible for the series. We even have an opening that just screams we know what the players want and we're ready to give it to them. After all, we begin the game with Samus flying in with her signature ship in front of a giant morph ball looking planet onto a space station where a distress signal has gone out. Pretty reminiscent of Super Metroid if you ask me. After being given a small playground to learn the new controls of this game, our prologue ends with the reveal of Mecha Ridley and of course, a patented Metroid-style self-destruct escape sequence. Any returning player will also greatly enjoy finding those familiar features like the different beams, but it's also exciting to see how some of the features change to fit this new format. By the time you've reached what feels like mid-game, you're thrown a lot of new responsibility all at once. Of course, this comes with all of the tools and fun gadgets that will be necessary for your success, but actually juggling the task comes down to your own prowess as a bounty hunter. The excitement created by giving these fun tools, intense responsibilities, and interesting features to any stalwart space explorer is certainly what's so great about Metroid Prime. Thank you all for joining us on this episode of What's So Great About Gaming, as we explored a new world in Metroid Prime. I'd like to thank Voltricity and Easy00Money01 for suggesting this game. Make sure to tell us what you think about Metroid Prime, or even suggest a game for another video. If you want to help in supporting the channel, consider checking out our Discord, Twitch, or Patreon. Links for all of those are in the description. If you want to hear what's great about another game, check out the link to our last episode, Pokemon's 5th Generation, on screen or in the description. And please take the time to subscribe to be involved in the discussions here. Thanks again for watching. Now go play a great game. We'll see you next time.